Hello again everyone and welcome back to my workshop. I was asked a question the other day by someone who did not want to make as many flight modes as he needed because he wanted trim separate for the landing flaps, but with many flight modes in normal flight needing trimming as well, this seemed like a lot of work to do because on a maiden flight you'd amend the trim in one of your normal fly-around modes and then have to go through each mode retrimming each of those as well. And then if you subsequently wanted just a tiny bit of trim, again you'd have to go through each of the modes again separately. Now the answer to that was, well, use the flight mode groups, and you can imagine what question came back to that. So this is a handy little thing when you're using flight mode separate trims. You might have, obviously, for landing flaps, you've got takeoff and you've got a landing flap mode, and you want separate elevator trim in those. But instead of just one mode for normal flying around, you've got several modes, and you know that they're all going to use the same elevator trim, and you don't want to be having to go through every mode one at a time, retrimming the elevator. So how do we use that? Well, I've got 5 flight modes set up on this model. And we've got flight mode 3, 4 and the default. So those are our normal fly around modes. And we want each of those 3 to use the same trim, share the same value, not be a separate one on each flight mode. And I've got takeoff and landing modes, and they want separate elevator trims for them. So we go to the fine-tuning menu, into our digital trim, down to elevator, into here, and instead of setting them as separate, we're going to assign particular modes to a group. We've got 2 groups we can use as well as separate. So where is this flight mode group A? Because in the flight mode screen there's nothing to assign them to groups. Well, you create it literally by selecting this. So we go to a flight mode that we want to be in flight mode group A and select it. Now, as you can see, elevator is now, instead of being S for separate, it's in flight mode A. But I only did that in flight mode number 3. So if I change to flight mode number 4, or default, or takeoff, or landing, they're still separate. So I'll go back now to number 4 and set it to flight mode group A as well. Now I'll go to flight mode 5 and set that to flight mode group A as well. So the mode 5 will default mode name. 4 and 3 are all flight mode A, but takeoff and landing are still completely separate. So now we can have a look at the effect of that. If you're wondering where I got this little screen box, trim box for on the screen, it's in displayed telemetry, system, trim. And I've selected a double size box because it's easier to see than a single size box. One of the advantages of having this on screen is that when you press the trim buttons, it doesn't jump to the whole screen being taken over by the trim screen for several seconds and you then wait for it to disappear. It's also dependent on having one on the page. So if we had a second page that we were on in displayed telemetry and it did not have the trim box on that page, then when you press the trim buttons, the whole trim screen would appear. So anyway, we can see here the effect of it. I'll come back to our 3 modes that want to share a trim. And it doesn't matter which of the modes we're in, it will share the trim across them. So we'll start in mode 3 and I'll give it some up elevator trim. There we go. And we can now see that if I go to mode 4 and default mode, that trim is shared across them. And I can alter that trim, fine tune it in any of those modes. I'll go back a little bit and it's still shared across them. But if we go to our takeoff and landing modes, they still have their completely independent trim. So I'll go takeoff down a bit to there, landing, we'll go down a bit to there. So there we are, landing mode and takeoff mode for for your flaps still have their own completely independent trims, but the other flight modes all have a shared trim. Nice and easy.